Once upon a time, Liechtenstein was a country of farmers and shepherds. Today, it is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Or at least its citizens are. Some say that Liechtenstein's economic miracle is due to its status as a tax haven, but that has only been a part of their economic strategy. Hello, welcome back to Business Secret, and today we are talking about Liechtenstein. Yes, we know, you don't know where it is, and the name is quite difficult to pronounce. Liechtenstein is a tiny state located between Austria and Switzerland. Its history dates back to the Middle Ages. At that time, the region belonged to the Holy Roman Empire, although it wasn't called Liechtenstein yet. The name actually comes from the noble family of the same name, who in 1322 acquired the county of Vaduz, which is now the capital of the Principality. Over the years, the Liechtenstein family expanded their territory through acquisitions and marriages with other noble families in the area. Let's fast forward to 1719 when Emperor Charles VI of the House of Habsburg created the independent Principality of Liechtenstein. Even during these years, the Principality was subject to various laws and obligations of the empire, while still maintaining a certain degree of autonomy. When the Holy Roman Empire collapsed in 1806, Liechtenstein became a fully sovereign and independent state. However, it was a small and economically weak state, lacking strong military forces. Therefore, the Principality decided to become part of the Confederation of the Rhine, an alliance of German states that had been created under the influence of Napoleon Bonaparte. Joining the Confederation of the Rhine offered Liechtenstein greater protection against external threats. By aligning with this alliance, led by Napoleon Bonaparte, Liechtenstein hoped to ensure its security and protect its independence. Although the truth is that no one was ever really interested in Liechtenstein. Let's be honest. Who would have been interested in a country of farmers and shepherds, poor and isolated in the middle of the mountains? Exactly. No one. However, joining the Confederation of the Rhine also offered political and economic advantages. It was, in fact, an economic union that facilitated free trade and promoted commercial development among its members. However, this alliance lasted only a few years. After the fall of Napoleon, Liechtenstein withdrew from the Confederation of the Rhine and re-established relations with Austria, reaffirming itself once again as an independent principality. Clearly, they were determined to maintain their independence. Now, let's move on to 1852. In this year, Liechtenstein became part of a new customs union with Austria to facilitate trade between the two countries, free from tariffs and restrictions. During this period, Liechtenstein became heavily dependent on food and raw material supplies from the Austrian Empire. At the same time, there were signs of industrialization in the Principality, which had lagged far behind the European powers. For instance, during these years, the first Swiss manufacturing industries were established in the territory of Liechtenstein. Let's go a little further. When the Austro-Prussian War broke out in 1866, Liechtenstein decided to stay out of it, as it often did throughout its history. Okay, to be honest, it didn't completely stay out of it. It trained 80 men for the Austro-Prussian War. It was during this war that the Principality decided to abolish the army, although the state reserved the right to reinstate the armed forces if needed. Even today, Liechtenstein is one of the few states in the world that does not have armed forces. But let's go back in time for a moment. The outbreak of World War I arrives, and unsurprisingly, Liechtenstein decided to remain neutral. In reality, it was facing a bigger problem. The risk of becoming isolated and halting the small economic growth it had started thanks to the agreements with Austria. Due to the rugged terrain of the Principality with mountains and rivers, the movement of people and goods was already quite challenging, and as we know, the economy requires connections. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 only made things more complicated. Firstly, the supply line of goods and food with the Austro-Hungarian Empire was disrupted. The reason was simple. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had devoted all its resources to the war effort. Additionally, despite being neutral, Liechtenstein was geographically situated amidst enemy lines. The Principality was also affected by the economic embargo established by the Allied forces. Alone, Liechtenstein could not produce enough food to meet the needs of its citizens. Therefore, it had to start importing food from neighboring Switzerland, but at a high cost. Since the Principality had no money in its coffers, it had to start accumulating debt with Switzerland. Everything came to a standstill. Even the Swiss industries that had taken root in the territory of the Principality before the war had returned to their homeland after the war erupted. So, despite not participating in the war, Liechtenstein emerged from the conflict burdened with an enormous public debt that seemed impossible to repay for such a small nation. Consider the citizens of the Principality, who were already relatively poor before the war. They had to find a way to survive in a rapidly changing world. Since Liechtenstein had to sever ties with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was struggling. And now that it had formed a new economic union with Switzerland, one might wonder, what did the Swiss gain from this? At first glance, making an economic agreement with one of the poorest nations in the world doesn't seem like a good deal. However, the Swiss are not fools, not today, and certainly not their grandparents at that time. Firstly, Liechtenstein was a small economy, and to revive such a small economy, it doesn't take much. Money would suffice. Secondly, having a stable and strong neighboring country would be an advantage for Switzerland. They wanted to create a kind of buffer state between them and Austria. Their goal was to turn Liechtenstein into an economic powerhouse so that it would no longer have trouble repaying its debts. On the other hand, the benefits for Liechtenstein were enormous. It can be said that this agreement with Switzerland marked a real turning point for the Principality. The economic union also included a monetary union, meaning that Liechtenstein started using the same currency as Switzerland, the Swiss franc, in a few years. This currency was undoubtedly more stable and secure than the ones used up until that moment. Having a single currency within a converging economic system, that is, operating at the same pace, simplifies everything. As a result, Liechtenstein had full access to the much larger and more advanced Swiss economy. One practical outcome was that the citizens of the Principality could freely go to work in Switzerland, where they found better qualified jobs, more employment opportunities, and significantly higher wages. There was another factor that allowed Liechtenstein to repay its debts and stabilize its economy. Prince Johann II began selling some precious items belonging to the royal family, including famous works of art, and used the proceeds to repay part of the Principality's debts. However, Liechtenstein still faced the same barriers that limited its development. 1. The lack of funds to finance large projects. 2. The absence of technical expertise, because they were still too backward. And 3. The lack of a suitable workforce to industrialize the country. The first thing the Principality sought to achieve was a significant foreign investment. The problem, however, remained the same. Liechtenstein did not attract enough investors, primarily because it had very little to offer. In these difficult years, the thoughts of both citizens and the state underwent a radical change. They became aware of their weaknesses and began to act accordingly. They needed to find something to leverage to attract the attention of foreign investors. We are in the period between the two world wars, and countries are reorganizing, each facing its own historical moments. Liechtenstein, for its part, needs to revitalize its economy. One of the initial moves was the enactment of the first constitution of the Principality. The constitution not only granted greater political power to the citizens but also laid the foundation for what would be the Liechtenstein of the future. During the same period, some laws were enacted to reduce taxes. Or almost. Firstly, for the citizens of the Principality. Then, they began to look at foreign investors. 2 laws were passed, providing certain protections and privileges to companies. One of these laws gave rise to domiciliary companies. These were companies registered in Liechtenstein but did not conduct business directly in the Principality. In essence, foreign companies could register their headquarters within the territory of the Principality. In exchange, these companies paid a tax to Liechtenstein, which was negligible compared to the tax savings, and they could continue to manage their activities as they pleased. That is, they were not obligated to conduct business within the Principality. Clearly, this was a way to attract foreign investors by allowing them to pay fewer taxes. With this practice, Liechtenstein gained without having to do much. So gradually, more and more companies started establishing sites in Liechtenstein, both Swiss and non-Swiss companies. The fees to be paid were negligible for each company. However, when we multiply this small fee by all the companies that began to have their headquarters in Liechtenstein, we understand the extent of the Principality's gains. If you visit countries that use these tax arrangements, you may notice that in some places, there are several plaques displaying the addresses of some companies. Yet, there are no actual offices there. But let's get back to Liechtenstein. In a short time, the number of companies registered in Liechtenstein doubled. Thanks to these measures, the revenues increased, along with the fact that Prince Johann II continued to sell precious family items. This allowed the Principality to embark on a major project for the country's industrialization, its first hydroelectric plant. Additionally, another turning point for Liechtenstein's economy was introduced: the laws on banking secrecy. After the war, some banks in the Principality became a reference point for companies that were part of the now-defunct German and Austro-Hungarian empires. These were companies that felt exposed and unprotected by their own governments. Let's remember that we are still in the period between the two world wars. In essence, Liechtenstein had taken the first step towards what would perhaps become the key to its economic miracle, becoming a tax haven. However, just as things were looking promising, a crisis hit the financial markets. Not just any crisis, but the crisis of all crises, the 1929 stock market crash. One of the worst crises ever, which caused the Great Depression in the United States and had far-reaching effects worldwide. This financial event was followed by the outbreak of World War II, with Liechtenstein, of course, remaining neutral. Surprisingly, Liechtenstein did not suffer much from an economic standpoint. This was because in the meantime, the Principality had initiated its industrialization process. It involved establishing specialized schools to support the birth of new industries, particularly in the manufacturing sector. Once again, part of the credit goes to Switzerland. On the other hand, despite declaring neutrality, Switzerland was preparing for a potential invasion and had deployed some of its workforce for this purpose. As a result, there were vacant job positions. Many Swiss companies decided to shift their entire production line to Liechtenstein. Swiss entrepreneurs could rely on the skilled workforce of Liechtenstein, as well as its favorable tax incentives. In some sectors, Liechtenstein had even become more specialized than Switzerland itself, such as in the precision instrument sector, for which it is still renowned today. While the global economy was devastated by the war, Liechtenstein emerged with a growing economy. Finally, after years of hardship, it was preparing for a future of prosperity. After the end of the war, Liechtenstein embarked on one of the most significant economic expansions in its history. What was once one of its weaknesses, hindering its growth for years, had now become a strength: its small size. The fact that it was a tiny nation ensured that the Principality remained outside of conflicts, and at the same time, the new fiscal policies allowed for the country's industrialization. After World War II, the climate in Europe underwent a radical transformation. Both the victorious and defeated countries began to adopt a new vision. They sought to put an end to wars and conflicts, striving for stability to enable the economy to grow peacefully. Consequently, Liechtenstein no longer had to worry about invasions or attacks, given the relaxed atmosphere prevailing in Europe. Moreover, being small meant that certain policies had a more significant impact. Take, for example, the case of domiciliary companies. If this policy were to be implemented in a larger country like France, the beneficial effects would be spread over millions of citizens, thus limiting the net benefit. However, in Liechtenstein, during the 1950s, the population was only 12,000 inhabitants. The net benefit, in this case, was magnified, and the overall positive impact on the economy of the small principality was immense. Now you might wonder, how do citizens benefit from a policy concerning the taxes of foreign companies? Well, the benefits came indirectly. Thanks to these revenues, the government could afford lower income taxes, and at the same time, these funds allowed the state to invest more in welfare. So, there were more and higher quality services, which, on average, were less expensive because they were supported by the state. The last benefit of being a small state that we want to analyze is its impact on governance. Since the early days of the first constitution, Liechtenstein's politicians aimed to find a way to converge their ideals and ensure that the government operated as effectively, efficiently, and stably as possible. Having a long-lasting government that works in unison solely for the country's well-being is a significant advantage that larger states often lack. It is easier to maintain a stable government in a small country because there are relatively fewer interests at stake. The primary interest is the welfare of the country and its 12,000 inhabitants in this case. According to some studies, when there are fewer interests at play in politics, corruption cases are also less likely. This is because with fewer interests, it becomes less profitable to bribe a public official. Especially after World War II, Liechtenstein's politicians sought to create a common policy that ensured stability and tranquility in the country. This also applies to foreign investors. Knowing that the government of the country where they are investing is stable instills more confidence and encourages greater investment, both in the country's debt and its company. On the other hand, if a country is unstable, investors will be less confident in putting money into any activity within its territory. In summary, both political stability and pro-business policies have led to a flood of foreign investments after the war. Liechtenstein's economic expansion allowed it to overcome another of its past problems, its geographic conformation, which had left much to be desired. Thanks to investments in new technologies and innovations in engineering, transportation, energy, and communications, they managed to solve transportation and energy supply problems. But the real reason for the Principality's economic boom was the Marshall Plan, the American investment plan for Europe. How did this happen, you may ask? Liechtenstein hadn't even participated in the war. Well, the Marshall Plan included a series of economic aid packages for nations in need, aiming to restart their economic machinery after the war. As a result, many states required financial and industrial support. By a fortunate coincidence, Liechtenstein was equipped to provide both. Offering financial and industrial services, the Principality became a global powerhouse within a few years, at least in these areas. When other powers returned to mass production, Liechtenstein made another one of its brilliant moves. Unable to rely on the same workforce as Germany, France, or Italy, it decided to specialize in niche production, highly specialized and concentrated in specific sectors. This kind of production emphasized quality over quantity, and as we mentioned earlier, they were highly skilled in precision mechanics. They focused on sectors like machinery and equipment components, precision instruments, and dental equipment. They further expanded into pharmaceuticals and advanced electronic sensors. One of the reasons for the Principality's specialization in these sectors is their high competitiveness. The government also allowed them to compete freely among themselves. Given Liechtenstein's small population, 95% of these companies based their activities on export. This means that to compete in the international market, they always had to stay one step ahead of others. The end result was that the Principality's manufacturing sector became increasingly renowned. This is precisely why Liechtenstein is a leader in certain sectors despite its tiny size. For instance, 20% of dentures and dental equipment worldwide come from Liechtenstein. However, the economic miracle of Liechtenstein was also driven by another sector. In addition to its industrial prowess, the sector for which it is perhaps most famous is banking and financial services. Unfortunately, not always for positive reasons. Especially in the 1970s, Liechtenstein had become a kind of safe haven for those with money. We're not just talking about famous investors or managers, but also about questionable characters, such as notorious drug lord. These individuals were attracted to the country for various reasons: its political stability, neutrality, connection to the Swiss monetary system, and especially for its banking secrecy. Many financial institutions in Liechtenstein allowed these individuals to preserve, manage, and in some cases even launder their fortunes. However, it should be noted that the worst cases of money laundering were isolated incidents. Over the years, the main banks have become experts in legal finance, so to speak. They specialized in accounting, managing investment funds, and financial holdings. It is also true, however, that data shows around 50,000 entities benefited from their services to avoid paying taxes and thus regarded Liechtenstein as a genuine tax haven. The economic boom during these years allowed the government to focus on its citizens. It maintained consistently low taxes while investing in welfare. Significant investments were made in education, infrastructure, and healthcare, all while keeping public debt practically at zero. Another boost to the economy came in the 1990s with the accession to three major agreements: joining the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, the European Economic Area, EA, and the World Trade Organization, WTO. Becoming a part of these agreements meant gaining direct access to a much larger potential market of about 500 million people. For a nation that relies almost exclusively on the export of goods and services, this was a momentous turning point. One of the immediate results was that the manufacturing sector grew to the extent that it surpassed the number of available workers entering the workforce. This led Liechtenstein to become a net importer of labor. As of today, almost half of its workforce comes from neighboring Austria and Switzerland. This growth has made the citizens of Liechtenstein among the richest in the world. However, the growth of this small nation has also attracted criticism, particularly regarding the opaque financial maneuvers of its financial sector. The status of being a tax haven eventually tarnished the country's image, similar to what happened to Switzerland. During the 2000s, various financial scandals emerged, blaming the Principality for being a hub for international money laundering. As a consequence of these scandals, Liechtenstein was put on the OECD blacklist. In response, in 2009, Liechtenstein decided to abandon banking secrecy, at least formally. The government chose to cooperate with OECD countries to prevent tax evasion and money laundering. This decision had a negative impact on the growth of the financial sector, which nevertheless remains attractive for those seeking legal financial services. Furthermore, the country's international reputation suffered a bit because, in practice, Liechtenstein had admitted to acting illegally in some cases. But now that it has abandoned banking secrecy, or at least it should have, what will the future hold for Liechtenstein? As of today, Liechtenstein ranks high in various lists certifying the well-being of its citizens. It has the second highest per capita income in the world, second only to that of the Principality of Monaco. Additionally, Liechtenstein ranks second in life expectancy and at the top for the Human Development Index. The citizens of the Principality have access to one of the best healthcare systems globally, and the same goes for education. At the same time, the state continues to maintain low income taxes. Far from being just a tax haven, it seems more like a paradise in general. The crime rate is very low, and the unemployment rate is just slightly above 1%. The job market, particularly in the manufacturing industry and the financial services sector, is well-oiled with new job opportunities always available. However, if you are considering moving there are also some weaknesses to consider. One of these, so to speak, is the high cost of living, including the cost of housing. Only a few can afford to own a house in the Principality, but salaries are adjusted to the cost of living. The boom that allowed Liechtenstein to transition from a rural village to an economic powerhouse was mainly possible thanks to the policies implemented by the governments, especially from the post-war period onwards. Free market policies allowed some companies to compete in international markets against global powers. And let's not forget that the tax haven status also provided a significant boost. But whether Liechtenstein has reached its current status even without banking secrecy, we leave it for you to decide. As for us, we'll stop here for today. See you in the next video. Goodbye.